My grandmother lived in a world of manicures, hair salons, and no place to go in the morning. She shopped and played endless card games, the king and queen of hearts, spades, clubs, and diamonds, absorbing all of her intellectual energy. She was caught in a bad marriage with nothing to fill her days. She missed feminism, my mother told me, by only a few years. It would have saved her. Now, this is one of my favorite books. It's by a writer named Roiphe. It was published in 1993 when she was still a graduate student at Princeton. So she was very precocious and already very accomplished, even in her mid-20s when she wrote this. And I love this book because it has so many, I think, very interesting ideas about not only what feminism has become, but also it diagnoses some of the underlying problems with the excesses of the MeToo movement, even though this book came long before the MeToo movement. Now, the title of this book is The Morning After: Sex, Fear, and Feminism. And I just want to read to you some of my favorite excerpts, and I think that'll give you an idea of why I think this book is so important, and then I'm going to discuss some of it. All right, so she was talking about her grandmother, right? Now, this was written in the 90s, and so she's talking about a woman that we would associate then with a much older generation, right? And so what she's saying here is that her grandmother, this writer feels her grandmother suffered being constricted in a bad marriage, not having anything to do with her time but play cards. Now, is there something perhaps a little bit classist about that, right? I'm sure there are many people, many hardworking people who would love to just be able to sit around and play cards. But the point that she's making is interesting, and this is something that I want to say right at the outset here. I have been accused by some people of hating women and being misogynist, and also, which is clearly not true, and also I've been accused of not recognizing or understanding that there is a long history of women being restricted in various ways, women's rights, being restricted, and women's activities and possibilities and everything. And I've never said that that's not the case. Absolutely, that's the case. The human race has a very long history of all kinds of injustices and problems and things that we are trying to work through and get beyond. What I have said, though, is that what we have seen emerge in modern feminism, I'm not talking about some of these earlier movements or earlier incarnations of the movement or earlier waves, although even those sometimes have their problems like everything does, but I recognize that there are all kinds of things that I'm able to do that I wouldn't have been able to do if I had been in my great-grandmother's generation, which is now the generation she's basically talking about here. I look at my grandmother. She's dead now, but she was a very, very highly intelligent woman, every bit as smart as I think that I am, right? Very, very sharp. And I remember that she didn't get her college degree, because back then, the accepted thing to do, as a number of you know, right, was to get married and get your MRS degree, and that's basically all you had to worry about. Not that a number of women didn't go to college or finish college or have jobs or careers, but it was definitely very different than now, and that was not something that a lot of women even knew that they could consider. So my grandmother, and we're talking about I guess this would have been in the late 1940s. My grandmother, she got married fairly young, early 20s, had children. And then she asked my grandfather if she could go to school or if she could get her certification in real estate, like her real estate license, basically, because she had an interest in doing something other than being a mom and a housewife. Not that there's anything wrong with any of those things, and I know people always say that. There's nothing wrong with that, but I really mean it. I think that being a mom and a housewife without any career is not only a perfectly acceptable existential calling in life, but in many ways could be superior, and probably is superior to all kinds of other things that people could be doing, right? All right, so this is not anything, nothing against that, right? But she wanted something more, right? Yeah, there are some people who are more cut out to be housewives and mothers than others, and there are some people who need different kinds of stimulation, all right? And so she wanted to get her, and maybe she wanted some independence too, because I think my grandfather was cheating on her. So she asked him, they were very old fashioned, so she had to run it past him. And he thought about it and he said no, he did not. He wanted to have a totally full-time woman at home. Now, I certainly recognize that those kinds of attitudes were a problem. But what I will say is that we've come a hell of a long way. And one of the things then that this book gets into is the way in which certain more recent movements in feminism, going back even to the early 90s, like the 80s and early 90s when this book was published, certain of these more recent movements in feminism are not feminist. In fact, they're very problematic from a feminist perspective. So as I read this, the interesting parts of this to you, just keep in mind that is the setup for this. This woman, Katie Roiphe, when she wrote this, she was a highly educated woman. She was getting her PhD in English at Princeton. No easy feat. She was as she'll talk about here, she was the daughter of a pretty famous feminist writer. And so she entered graduate school prepared, I believe, and she discusses this a bit, prepared to go along with the party line about feminism and what feminism meant and what it means to care about women and women's issues and stuff. But she quickly became disillusioned and disenchanted with the political climate and with the attitudes in academia and on campus about certain things, such as MeToo type, what we'd recognize today as MeToo type issues. All right, so I want to actually read this to you with minimal commentary from here on. I'm going to add some comments here and there, but I just want you to hear this, and I'm very curious to get your comments and see what you think. It's amazing to me how the questions that she's raising, the ideas that she's raising, the objections, the issues, this is still like very, very relevant stuff, perhaps now more than ever. So this book is very, very, very prescient. Prescient? I'm always messing that up. But in a lot of ways, it really is. Okay, so here we go. So she was just talking about her grandmother. So when I was very young, I thought of feminism as something like a train that you could catch and ride to someplace better. My grandmother missed it, but my mother caught it. I knew it was all about having your own work before work meant anything to me but the sound of my mother's typewriter behind closed doors. In the 60s, my mother had written Up the Sandbox, an early feminist novel recounting the elaborate escape fantasies of a bored housewife. Feminism had a lot to do with my mother's own escapes. I knew that. She would never let my younger sister and me watch The Brady Bunch because it was sexist. All right, so then she talks about her upbringing and how her mother raised her with all of these feminist beliefs, in the 60s and the 70s. And then she says, "This is where I come from. I didn't spend much time thinking about feminism. It was something assumed, something deep in my foundations. When I got to Harvard in the fall of 1986 as an undergraduate, all of that changed. I found something called feminism that was unfamiliar to me. The feminism around me in classrooms, conversations, and student journals was not the feminism I grew up with. The Take Back the Night marches and the sexual harassment peer counseling groups were alien, and even sometimes at odds with what I thought feminism was. All of a sudden, feminism meant being angry about men looking at you in the street and writing about, quote, the colonialist appropriation of the female discourse, unquote. And yes, that is exactly what academic writing, unfortunately, often is. It is meant to obfuscate more often than not, whether the writers realize it or not. And I can't tell you how many times I've read obfuscate, meaning clouding the truth instead of providing it. I can't tell you how many times I've read papers over the years, academic papers, whether it's from professors or grad students, in which at the end of it, I felt like I actually knew less than before I had begun. But there are all these like pretty, words and sophisticated sounding words. But anyway, okay. At Harvard, oh no, this is good. This is really good. At Harvard and later at graduate school in English literature at Princeton, I was surprised at how many things there were not to say, that you couldn't say, at the arguments and assertions that could not be made, lines that could not be crossed, taboos that could not be broken. The feminists around me had created their own rigid orthodoxy. You couldn't question the existence of a rape crisis. You couldn't suggest that the fascination with sexual harassment had to do with more than sexual harassment. You couldn't say that Alice Walker was just a bad writer. She's a very well-known feminist writer, I think a black feminist writer. She wrote The Color Purple, which is a good movie. But anyway, what she's making fun of here is that, like, you can't even, in these circles, you couldn't even criticize a black female writer without someone accusing you of being, sexist or racist. Sound familiar? You couldn't say that Alice Walker was just a bad writer. Corsanta. You couldn't say that Alice Walker was just a bad writer. And the list of couldn'ts went on and on. Listening to feminist conversations in and out of class, I was surprised at how fenced in they were, how little territory there was that could actually be disputed. And this was very much my opinion of my experience when I was in grad school. I got my PhD in English literature, not at Princeton. No, not at Princeton, but at a top 20 program. And so, it was considered to be like the elite of the elite, right? Very elite, program for what I was in. And my experience too was that even though most of the professors were nice, and I would say more often than not, most of them meant well, and I respected most of them as people, but it was so still for most of them, it was so close-minded in the sense of there's still this political orthodoxy that was just like assumed, right? So she says, I remember sitting through a workshop on date rape freshman year thinking, this is not me. This has nothing to do with me. Now, obviously, she's not saying that it's impossible that she would ever be raped on a date, right? She's saying that the kinds of philosophies and ideas and attitudes that were being promoted in this campus workshop on date rape, she felt were non-feminist and didn't represent her. And we're going to talk more about what those are. But one of them is the idea of the infantilized woman, which she says here. The naive female victim in the film being shown was worlds away from me. Her dress, it was not the kind of dress that I would wear on a date. She was passive and innocent and overly impressed by the boy's intelligence. She didn't drink. She seemed like a goody-goody. It might as well have been a documentary about the mating habits of the fruit fly because it didn't resemble what I had done. The thing that I didn't know then was that the mating rituals of a rape-sensitive community and the attitudes that went along with them would be a part of feminism as I would experience it from then on. A new bedroom politics had entered the university. Fighting date rape and sexual harassment seemed to unite and inspire the feminists around me. Everything was cut and dried. It was feminist against the world, us against them, and increasingly I was feeling like I was them. Now, get what she's saying here, right? Like, she is the daughter of a feminist writer and icon. She comes from this family where she was given this, what we would all consider an unusually feminist upbringing. And she's going to this Ivy League school getting her PhD in Princeton. And yet she's saying, I feel like I'm an alien here. As I see it, now this is a really interesting part. As I see it, there are more than two sides to any issue. And feminists are closer to their backlash than they'd like to think. The image that emerges from feminist preoccupations with rape and sexual harassment is that of women as victims, offended by a professor's dirty joke, verbally pressured into sex by peers. I would add groomed in, their 20s, right? This was back when she wrote this, the idea that someone, an adult woman, 18 years old or older could be groomed by a man, even an older man, that was considered, it wasn't even something that people were thinking about because it was so ridiculous. I've said this before, and so has Andrea Burkhart, and I'll say this again. Grooming, it used to be a term to refer to strategies that pedophiles would use in order to make children become accustomed to being touched or being approached in sexual or abusive ways. It is morphed, and I don't know who did it or at what point, I'm looking into it, but it is morphed from that into this notion that a woman in her early, mid, even late 20s can be groomed by an older man. I just reject that. I just completely reject that thinking and that philosophy and whatever. But anyway, And that's one of the problems in a very Orwellian sense with what the media and what some of these activists are doing to our language. If you haven't watched it, look at the video I did on George Orwell and Amber Heard. I know that seems like a weird pairing, but one of the things that I get into in that is the way in which some of these modern political movements, such as MeToo and the modern media, mainstream media, have been expanding or changing the usage of terms to a degree that is really just diluting the impact of the language, or it's distorting and really dangerously so the meaning and the impact of words. Okay, let's continue because this is a good passage. This image of a delicate woman bears a striking resemblance to that 1950s ideal my mother and the other women of her generation fought so hard to get away from. Let me read that again. This image of a delicate, I would add, infantilized woman bears a striking resemblance to that 50s ideal my mother and the other women of her generation fought so hard to get away from. They didn't like her passivity, her wide-eyed innocence. They didn't like the fact that she was perpetually offended by sexual innuendo. They didn't like her excessive need for protection. Amen. I have talked on this show before about the idea that you cannot have 100% safety and 100% freedom at the same time. Whine about it as some of us might, or complain or be upset. And, I guess it is really tragic, honestly. I shouldn't have said whine, okay? It's a tragic thing. It would be wonderful if we lived in a world where we could have 100% freedom and 100% safety, but we can't. And so we have to grow up. We have to be adults. We have to acknowledge that. And what she is saying here is that for a long time, what the feminists like her mother and so many other women that established, that built feminism, whether you agree with it or you don't, and God knows that even the early incarnations of feminism had their issues, but what people look back to as classical feminism, right, and what people look back to as, second wave feminism, a lot of what it was about was trying to expand freedom for women and trying to lessen or fight this notion that women were in need of excessive protection, because for so long that was the rationale used for restricting them, right? Is this idea that, well, you're the more delicate creature, you are vulnerable, much more vulnerable to men, to violence and so forth, and so you need to remain a virgin until marriage. You need to have a chaperone. When you go to college, you're going to check in by 11 o'clock every night or you're going to be in trouble. Hey, some of you who are in college now, this was literally a thing. My mom had this at her dorm. They didn't want the girls out after a certain time at night. So you could not sleep with your boyfriend or whatever. You had to come in and check in, right? If you were in the dorms. All kinds of stuff like this that people are not even aware of. And so what happened is the feminists of old, they fought to be able to have free sex, right? To be able to have premarital sex, or to be able to do it without societal censure or whatever. And after the pill with fewer consequences. Now we can debate, whether or not that ended up being healthy for women or whatever, but it's something I believe that women, should have had, the right to, right? To have those same sexual freedoms, but not just sexual freedoms, all kinds of other freedoms. Going back to, if you think about 100 or 200 years ago or whatever, the fight to, allow women greater, property rights and things like that. And all this stuff, okay, about the expansion of freedom. And here's my point, okay? Listen to me. What I'm trying to say and what she's trying to say here and what writers like Camille Paglia are trying to say is that anytime you focus heavily on protection instead of freedom, right, then what's going to happen is you're going to eventually have a reduction in freedoms. In other words, feminism is so focused now on this sort of infantilized perspective of women as vulnerable and victims and needing protection. And none of us are saying that women can't be victims, that terrible things don't happen at times. But what we are saying is that this overzealousness at times, these witch hunts, this insistence by certain Me Too feminists and activists that, for example, a woman in her early 20s or a woman even who's 18 is just cognitively deficient and like a baby when it comes to interacting with an older man. These things are emphasizing protection and also at the same time, unfortunately, entailing a view of women that is narrow and is getting narrower, and that will inevitably be a kind of confinement, engender a kind of confinement, confining repressive policies if taken to their most extreme conclusions. And that's what she's worried about. That's what she's saying. She says, I'm in college and I'm sitting here at this seminar, this workshop on date rape. And they've got the woman in this video who's playing the girl's role, and her attitudes are not modern. She's not sexually aggressive or interested or anything. This is like some kind of like 50s virgin. And the guy is so suave and intelligent and all that, right? She's saying, what is this? This is not feminist. And the suggestion that women need, constant protection and that all men are predatory and just waiting to pounce, or that 1 in 4 women are raped when they're in college because apparently the college campus is just a battle zone when it comes to women. None of those 1 out of 4 rapes would have anything to do with, alcohol being consumed or murky he said, she said situations or, regret afterward or anything like that, right? My experience in college was not that 1 out of 4 of my female friends were raped. Nowhere near that. And in fact, the most accurate statistics that we have coming from the Justice Department are that it's closer to like 1%, which, that's not good, but it's not the same thing as 1 out of 4. She says, this is great. Listen to this. She said, the feminists of old, they didn't like her passivity, her wide-eyed innocence. They didn't like the fact that she was perpetually offended by sexual innuendo. They didn't like her excessive need for protection. She represented personal, social, and psychological possibilities collapsed. And they worked and marched, shouted and wrote to make her irrelevant for their daughters. Let me say that one more time. They didn't like her excessive need for protection. This image of the innocent, woman, right? They didn't like her excessive need for protection. She represented personal, social, and psychological possibilities collapsed, restricted, right? And they, the feminists of old, worked and marched, shouted and wrote to try to make her irrelevant for their daughters so that their daughters could be free. But here she is again with her pure intentions and her wide eyes. Only this time, it is the feminists themselves who are breathing new life into her. Very interesting. I went ahead and recorded part 2 and am posting that to YouTube right now as well. So just click on the link below in the comments in the description and go to part 2. And I promise part 2 will have a lot more of me reading and less commentary, okay? So what I would like to do, this is part 1 in a series that I'm just going to do on this book. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put another one on my my YouTube page, and then I'll probably put 1 or 2 on my Patreon. And so again, if you haven't signed up for my Patreon, it's only a $3 minimum to get bonuses and extra videos and things like that. I'm also going to create a $5 tier that'll have a lot more material. But point is, if you want more of this, it will be available with the $3 tier. And I'll put the links below. Or if you've just enjoyed this and you want to tip me, as always, PayPal below, and you don't have to have an account, just a credit card. Okay, everybody, thanks so much. Bye-bye.